why, and how to say no to researchers. So I will add the caveat that when we were planning this call, we're making the assumption that most of us really want to help researchers achieve things and have a lot of researchers coming to us asking us to do things. And the rate of asking is larger than our capacity to deliver. And so if you're not in that situation, that's great. But probably most of us are in that kind of world. And so we wanted to talk about it a little bit. And so what we'll cover today, I'm going to put the slide link in the chat in a minute, is just briefly, reasons why we might have to say no to a researcher-specific request. Carrie is going to go through, I think, a really nice summary of when you're in that situation, how to make it work, ways you can say no, because it can be really hard to do, especially if you really want to help somebody. And then once we get to the second half of the call, we would like to talk a little bit about differences in this group of what you support and don't, and why or why not, and have you learned any lessons from that in particular that might be useful for other people. And if we have time, we'll talk about handing off between groups. So that's the plan for today. I think, so the previous slide has the survey that we are going to use as sort of a jumping off point for the second half. So do please fill that out now. It's just 3 questions so that we have that information. And so let's make sure touching on the opening stuff. I think that's it. I'm going to turn it over to, I'm not going to turn it over to Carrie. I'm going to do one more slide and then turn it over to Carrie. So I think most of us are familiar with these reasons why we can't do everything. But we thought it'd be helpful to just kind of provide a summary, and we can maybe come back to this framework when we talk about specific services later in the call. And so the big one, I think, is just lack of resources, money, time, and sometimes hardware. And so these can constrain, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, what we're able to do sort of in our day-to-day work. We might say no to things because we don't have the needed expertise to answer a particular question or help a particular group. And then the second two, I think, the last two, I think, are more strategic kind of things where maybe there's not really, you only have one person asking for this service, there's not really demand, or it's not aligned with kind of your purpose, your group, whatever that might be. So if you have any other ideas, I'd have you throw those in the chat so that we can bring them up later when we have discussion. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, who will talk about some ways, if you're in this situation where any of these is true, where you can't say, yes, I can do that to a researcher, some things that you can say instead.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. So I was doing a lot of research on saying no, how to say no, why we say no. There's not so much there as from the why perspective, but I did find a lot of interesting information on how to say no. And these are all strategies that I have personally utilized in the past. This one is probably one of my favorites. If you've ever spent more time with Henry from Oklahoma, this is also one of his favorites, is to say yes, but with conditions, right? Yes, we can do that for you, but we need something in exchange. We need money. We need, support, tasks, something that's tangible that will let us deliver on this. So we can delay this other task, then yes, we can deliver this for you. And that kind of puts the responsibility back on the requester, right? For them to provide what's needed to get that done, but you still come across as being willing to help and willing to help reach the goals. Next slide, please. Another one is kind of this group of strategies that involve redirection, right? And so this first one is to offer an alternative solution, right? If a researcher is asking you to complete one specific task and you may not be able to do that in the way that they want you to, but you might have some alternate approaches that you can suggest to them, right? A different resource to use, a different tool. And so that's another popular solution as well. Kind of on the same line is to refer them to a more appropriate source. So if you're at an institution where, say, your unit doesn't specifically handle cloud computing, or you don't do data storage, you may know other groups on campus that handle that, that have that responsibility. And you can hand that researcher off to those groups or refer them to that more appropriate source. Next slide. Redirecting work back to the requester. This can be tricky sometimes, but if you have a good situation where you can kind of put this back into that requester's, onto their plate, that's a good way to kind of get them to understand the work that might be involved. So, hey, can you maybe outline how this process would work? Or can you research some tools that you think would be applicable and come back and we can review whether or not they would work? Or would you be willing to find some other volunteers to help lead this effort? And then this last one is definitely redirection, but you can kind of phrase your redirection as questions, right? Have you heard about this particular organization? That's specifically what they do, and they have these resources that are there to help you. Are you familiar with this set of learning materials that might help answer your questions or help guide you through setting this up? So sending researchers documentations and organizational links is one of my favorite solutions to research questions. All right, next slide. Use delegated authority, right? I'm busy working on this because my director told me to. I'd be happy to work on your task, but you're going to have to get permission from him for me to split that time or to defer that. Or, our CIO wants us to focus on security at this moment, so we don't necessarily have personnel to work on this. And that's kind of yes, but it's in a different phrasing. Saying no through process. So if you get a lot of requests for the same thing that you can't deliver on, or you don't want to for, security reasons or other concerns, you can establish an overarching policy that you can then kind of shift the blame to, so to speak, right? So no, we can't give you sudo access on our login nodes because, cybersecurity protocol or policy, says that we can't because that's a security risk. And that way you're not personally taking the brunt of saying no. You can kind of point to something else and it's no longer your fault. All right, next slide. So these are not my favorite strategies, and you might feel the same way upon reading them. They're kind of non-solutions, so to speak, but they are strategies that exist if you need to use them. And one is avoiding the question or using some sort of gatekeeping system, right? So a lot of us use a ticket system for support requests. That's kind of our built-in gatekeeping to keep them from overwhelming us personally. Avoiding the question is great, where you can answer a whole email and just kind of skip that one inconvenient question and see if the researcher is persistent enough to bring it up again. So you kind of skirting around the issue, so to speak. And last but not least is to be vague and non-committal. That sounds like a great idea. We can't focus on it now. How about you contact us in a few months down the road and we'll see what we can do then. Or, give me some time, I'll ask around and I'll get back to you if there's any interest. And so that way you're not directly saying no, but you're also kind of indirectly letting the person know that this can't be a priority for you at this moment. All right. Any comments or questions about any of those?
Yeah, this is Serge. I'll just comment on the, this may be something we can look into later. That may actually be the factually correct statement if, we're looking at maybe a software upgrade or, in a project where the vendor, we know the roadmap, we know some capability is coming along in, the second half of the year or something, then I think that's what we should tell people if that's the case. But so it's not always vague and non-committal. Sometimes it's just what it is.
Absolutely. And I love having that kind of promise of a future ahead, right? That we're going to be looking at, doing a storage refresh, and that's something that we can definitely consider at that time.
Right. If you know that this is actually on a roadmap, then I think it's, absolutely the right thing to tell people. If you don't know, then of course it's not so great.
Absolutely. All With that, I'm going to turn things back over to Christina so we can hear more from you guys as a community.
Yeah. So I wanted to make a comment on this last slide. I saw this and I was like, oh, but it's true that sometimes I have done these things. I wish I didn't. I wish I, could always be direct and or say no to people, but sometimes these are things that have happened. So if you see yourself in these, you're not alone.
Well, and Christina, one thing I'd add is that being able to perceive how you're supposed to respond to being told these things is kind of culturally grounded. And, a lot of us work for researchers from so many different backgrounds that I'm just thinking about how some of these might end up causing confusion for someone who wasn't as familiar.
That's a great point, Jana, just this idea of cultural background. And it is true that I probably say no to PIs and not PIs, potentially in different ways, or depending on the urgency that they're expressing. Yeah,
So-
Daniel, would you be willing to share a little bit about what you put in the chat? Because I think it's a nice kind of extension of some of these examples that were shown. If you can unmute.
About which one, which ones to say no or alternatives?
Kind of alternatives.
Well, I have found out from experience that often end users don't really understand what they want to do and how to do it. In the sense of they might be very good at a specific field of science, but not really for computers or for the computer implementation approach. So very often, before I say no, I try to get into a conversation about trying to understand what they want to do and make them explain what they are trying to do. And then while they do that, I have the opportunity to understand exactly what is it that they are trying to achieve. And then I pitch it in my ideas about, hey, yeah, I understand that you want it like that, but have you considered if we go this way? Or what do you think if we do this? And very often they'll appreciate that because, this is an opportunity for them to give them another perspective, hopefully a better perspective on how to solve the problem or how to tackle the problem, whatever it is that they're trying to do. And that way I can kind of like say no and take them into another direction, hopefully a better and good direction.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. And I think that's kind of in the flavor of this redirection. But what I like about what you just described is that for me, it's helpful to remember that the reason I'm saying no, usually, is I want to help be as effective as possible and help researchers be as effective as possible. So sometimes it's really important to say no for exactly the reason you described, Daniel, is maybe the route the researcher is going down is not a good one. And so redirecting them, being like, actually, what are you really trying to accomplish? And then reaching to a point where you can help them is productive for both them and you. And so I think this really captures, if that's our goal, that's why we're doing this. And that can help us decide how to say no to people, when to say no.
And another piece of what Danielle was saying, just to build off what you were commenting on, Christina, is it's actually a service and it's a value to ask that question and talk that through. So even if no is the ultimate outcome for that original request, you've still supported research and provided something of value.
I just want to add to that the more you work with the researchers and they see that you're willing to help them achieve their goals, they will, they'll be more receptive to these no's too, because they're going to trust that you're there with them and will help them find the best solution.
I also think that if you just, invite them to have the conversation, I know that one can be tricky, right? Because they might be expecting that because you say, yes, let's talk about it. They might think that, yeah, you have all the answers and that you're probably going to do what they need. But I think that just creating a space where they can actually come and talk, and whether it's something that we can do right now, perhaps not, but if we can do it later, or think about what are the pieces that we are missing, right? I think that is one way also for us as an institution to grow. So if we can pick up, okay, what are the things that we're missing? What resources do we actually need to be thinking about adding, because there are a group of people that needs X, Y, or Z. And so I like to, having that opportunity to just get that conversation going, but trying to make it sure from the very beginning that this might not be something possible to do right away. We all had to be very tread carefully there, right? So that we don't just close the door, but we're still inviting the community to, faculty to be aware that we are here to help.
Yeah, that's also a great point, Gladys. All right, any other thoughts on like this kind of process of saying no, how we do it before we move on?
Well, I just want to add that this is a process. Some of you have already mentioned about having the end user trust our opinion, trust what we say or what we do. And I have found out that, well, that's just a process, that it takes time. So probably the first time when you're interacting with them, and probably the first time you're trying to tell them no, is hard. But after a while, after you have show or proof that your suggestions work well or work better, then it becomes easier.
Yeah, thanks.
Something else I would also just throw in here is sometimes when it's going to be a no, I think it's important to let the higher ups in your own chain know about what you've said and why, to just get ahead of, if you just happen to have said no in a situation where there might be some drama or fraught consequences, just to make sure people aren't taken by surprise, which is a judgment call, right? Because managers don't like to be told about every single decision, but they don't like to be blindsided either.
Yeah, it's a good practical observation, just keeping everybody in the loop. All right, well, we're gonna, I think, move on to this second major topic of this call, which is what services don't you offer and why? I think there's a lot of, as we saw at the beginning, there's a lot of reasons why you might or might not offer services. So for some of the ones that you don't offer, it might be easy to be like, well, we just don't support that, or that's just not what we do. So I think what we're more interested in here is services that maybe you have supported in the past or stopped, things you didn't do and now you do, kind of getting a sense of when it's been helpful to say no to things in your organization, and kind of what boundaries you've drawn around the services you offer. So I'm not quite sure how this conversation is going to go, but let's give it a try. So we made this list of services that I think a lot of us either support or are adjacent to. We had the Menti poll to kind of see where folks are at. And so I'm going to stop sharing. Martin, are you able to share the results?
Sure. My Zoom just froze on me. Would you mind, Christina, why don't you try to open the link and share the browser? For some reason, I'm not seeing any of the Zoom buttons for me here.
Okay.
The link is in the chat.
Yeah.
We posted it. Oh, no.
Is this?
Yes.
It? Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So let's go to the first page. This is the last page.
Interesting. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, so maybe I'll quickly go over this with my reasonings, and then we start jumping on. There is a few more responses in the chat, so that's great. So basically what we were after here is to see, what is the coverage of the support versus is not. And so I think things are pretty obvious on this slide that the topics that require more human resources are less being supported, right? Virtual machines take time because you have to personally set them up. Dedicated projects, they are the big time sinks as well. The cloud support, in my mind, is probably more because it's still relatively new, but it is complex as well. So you need to have expertise that takes time to learn. And then there are some more kind of technically challenging issues, or technically challenging topics like the protected data, the long-term data storage, and things like that. And things that are kind of more run-of-the-mill, like the one-on-one meetings or the software installations. Obviously, most of the people do, right? So that we can probably move on to the next slide. We can focus on a few things later on. And obviously, the biggest challenge is the lack of human resources. And second, interestingly, is the mandate, which is one of the no strategies we've discussed earlier, right? That you have sort of your job description is supposed to do this and that, and if it doesn't fall into that, then you can easily say that you are not able to do that. So that's like, again, something we've more or less expected, but it's good to see the proof. And I would be kind of curious to hear about the other. Maybe people can put things in the chat or in the call document. What is the other reasons why you don't do the support? Because that's something we haven't really thought of, right? And the same thing on the last slide. Then the last slide, we were more or less just looking at from our own experience, what do we do, right? So it's kind of to be expected in my mind as well that you are aware of what's happening on your campus, and you often send people to the appropriate people that might help that exist on a campus. And again, we have a fair amount of the others, so I'd be curious to see what the other answers were as well. And with that, maybe we can move on to our chat and what people have responded in the call document. And maybe, Christina, why don't you share the call document and we can discuss these things first. My personal interest is the office hours. And Annalie has written basically the same thing that we have, or the reasoning we have, that we don't do office hours because we more or less support one-on-one drop meetings. These days with Zoom, it's even simpler than it used to be. But it might be interesting to hear from someone who has done the same thing as we did, meaning one-on-one, and moved on to the office hours, and how that worked out for them, and why do they do it? So does anybody have anything to say on that?
Oh, I can make a comment there, Martin. So in our group, we have both, right? We do office hours, right? And we have set times that are in our website. And we realized that with having the access to just jump in a meeting, right? It made it so easier. So we had a big spike in the attendance when the pandemic just started, right? And it has stayed throughout the last, almost 2 years now. But we still have the one-on-ones, right? So there are users that request, or send an email that they would like to have a one-on-one session. We go about doing that. Sometimes what I do, if I am working in a project, then, I try to schedule those one-on-one maybe during those office hours, if I know that it might not be so busy, so that my hour is not just empty, right? But I think that it goes also to the preference of every facilitator, right? How do you want to manage that? But for us, has worked really well to, not just to have those one-on-ones, but have the office hours that are already, established, and that are fixed times during the week, every week. And so it makes it really easier for the user. They know where to find who. And so you will see that are recurring users, that they know exactly when to find us.
Thanks, Gladys. Carrie, go ahead. And folks, if you if you want to talk, feel free to like put a note in the chat, raise your hand, so we make sure that we get to everyone who wants to share.
I just kind of wanted to build on what Gladys said is it kind of, for us to get office hours up and running, it kind of took some focused redirection. So you get those support tickets that come in where you're like, gosh, I really wish I could look over this person's shoulder and see what they're doing. And those that, that's usually a clue that you want to meet with the person one-on-one. We would then tell them to come into the office hours, or we'd schedule that meeting during those office hours. And by, users start getting used to that model, they start adapting it on their own.
Great. Yeah, so other thoughts, I think the general, where I'd like to hear from folks is like, maybe we could combine the topics. How do you set boundaries or not around your meeting structure with people, whether that's one-on-ones or office hours, and how do those interact? Michael, go ahead.
Sure. So I'll just say, we find that office hours lower the barrier to entry, basically, that for people, there's a little bit of a hesitance in some cases to ask for a one-on-one meeting. It feels like a big demand. And so people are sometimes more willing just to show up to a pre-scheduled office hour when we'll be there anyway. There is the risk sometimes we end up just sitting there. That's not always the best use of our time. And we do one-on-one meetings as well. But it makes it easy to have people feel comfortable, especially if they're new. And oftentimes when I'm working with someone in the office hours, they say, well, I don't really know what I need. I don't know how to get started, even if they've maybe come to an orientation session. And so they don't feel like they deserve a one-on-one meeting, even though we'd be happy to do that and we can offer it. But I'll second what others have said about trying to schedule meetings during that, and about how doing it virtually since the pandemic has definitely made it easier for people to join, no matter where they are and how much time they have.
Thanks. Andy, go ahead.
Hi, I was just going to say that our experience was that office hours generally were not well attended. Back in the days when we had a set time and a physical location for that, more often than not, we just didn't get anybody come by. Since the pandemic started, we have not set up specific times, but made it incredibly easy to schedule one-on-one times via a scheduling plugin with Microsoft Outlook. And that's worked fairly well. I haven't necessarily seen the hesitancy with scheduling one-on-one times. People seem to enjoy that. And because it's via Zoom, the overhead is fairly low, and it's fairly easy to do those.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing, Andy. So I guess what I'm kind of hearing in this discussion is that some of this depends a little bit on, I don't know, culture and the background of your researchers that you're working with. And I guess both can be effective. What I really hear, I know the way that I use meetings and office hours is, it's my way of saying no to continuing conversation in a ticket. And it's so tempting to like type out this super long answer, but it's usually more efficient to say, nope, I'm not going to write that 5-paragraph email. And instead, I'm either going to schedule a one-on-one or invite someone to office hours, kind of depending what your culture and time availability is. Like, I think that's what I'm hearing, is figuring out what works for your group and so on. Any other thoughts on office hours? Then I highlighted a couple other topics in the notes where there seemed to be kind of half yes and no that I'd like to talk about. But
Christina, I see a hand raised, but I don't know if Andy already made his comment.
I think you did. Yeah. Okay. So with that, I'd love to talk a little bit about dedicated project support, because it seems like from the Menti results, about half of us don't do that, and maybe half of us do. And again, maybe not thinking so much of whether or not you do that, because that's probably related to some of your organizational structure, but like, what are some strategies to keep that manageable if you do offer it, or if people come to it and you can't help them either because you don't offer it as a service, or you can't, what do you say? Any volunteers?
If we don't have any volunteers to speak, I am immensely curious as to people who, if you don't offer it, is there differentiation between just, if you had funding, you would, or you won't at any cost? So I have previously been in a unit where we did not really do dedicated project support, but we were willing to do it if someone, gave us a line item in their grant to fund this person. Is anybody from a unit that won't do it at all in any capacity? I'll take that as a no. So I'm going to keep talking, but if you want me to shut up, feel free to raise your hand. So here at Penn State, we do have a team of scientists that do just this, that do dedicated project support. And actually, we offer seed grant funding for portions of their time in order to encourage these engagements that we call it. And after coming from an institution that didn't do that model, I have found that this is a really good way to get researchers familiar with your unit who might otherwise not be, because the minute you start offering them free funding, they're like, yes, I'm on board. And so when they start, and they get a little taste of that sort of support and effort from computational scientists, then they're kind of hooked and they want to keep coming back for more projects.
Carrie, how many hours do they get free?
So it depends on the seed grant. They have to kind of justify it, but usually we do them in about 100 to 300 hour chunks. So it's a good amount.
Thanks. I know there's some of you out there that work on projects. So I don't know, maybe it doesn't work at all. But I don't know, just thoughts about pros and cons of doing it. Carrie kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'd be kind of interested in knowing the reasoning. Yeah, Kirk, go ahead.
One of the problems that we have is chargeback. Even though we can probably get money into a grant to buy out, a month's worth of time. The problem is that our administration can't figure out how to convert that into something that's useful. Because I can't buy a month worth of sysadmin or programmer time to supplement or transfer those kinds of things. So we've actually been told, no, you are all in and you're free. And so part of that is, dedicated project time. What does that mean with respect to how long? Because my team will dedicate, a couple of weeks or a month or two to get something done, and then we spin off and do another one. So the reason we don't do official dedicated is because then it's very problematic as to priorities and funding structures.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think that's really illuminating about when this can and some of the obstacles to making this work and models for it working. Anyone else that has either similar experience to Kirk or something kind of a slightly different model of providing the support that does involve money?
Christina, if I may add. So the way how we do it in our group, we have these small contracts, right, that we do for 3 months. And so the users or the PI usually has to sign a form where we specify, how much of our time we can invest, in a specific project, right? And usually if it's something that's going to be longer than 3 months, then, the PI has to put some skin in the game, which means some of, our time has to be paid. And so that then would lead the administration just to do, the numbers based on, how much time they request. But in reality, you find that when you start working in a project, right, sometimes it takes more than 3 months because life continues to happen for that faculty member. Or if you're working with a student, right, or a group of students, a lot of things go there that there were no as planned. And so you just need to establish, how willing you are as a facilitator, also how much time you want to spend. And I think that just having that direct conversation with your manager or supervisor about, how much time you want to invest and why, right? I think that at least in our group, we have some of that freedom just to talk about, why I want to invest in this project. And we are all very encouraged to actually participate in projects, right? Now, if that's going to take, 50% of my time, then that has to be translated into numbers and how that particular group can pay some of my time.
Yeah, I wanted to say we basically have similar setup as Gladys, that we can solicit kind of long-term collaboration with other groups or with one of our customers, but it depends on how busy we are with our normal projects at the point, and also discussion with our supervisors that approve it, right? And so it's worked out pretty well in the past. We do deny, I guess, more than what we accept, but our researchers are kind of familiar with the process, at least the ones that use us regularly, that if there is a need that they have, they can sort of probe if there is availability on our end, and if there is, then we'll work with them. But that usually means that they contribute to our pay, right? And so I don't have a problem working with somebody for a few weeks, but then if it becomes more long-term process, then we end up getting paid partially by the researcher, and usually they are pretty good with that. So once they realize that this is a long-term, they don't have a problem in doing the pay contribution.
Yeah. Yeah, what I'm hearing from what people are sharing is that it feels like a few weeks is kind of like the right amount of time to potentially help people for free. And that beyond that, there really needs to be an investment, but that can be complicated by the structure in which you're living and the way that money flows. So I want to touch on at least one more topic before we end today. So I'll share the list in a minute. So if folks can see and kind of just pop into the chat if there's one of these that you would be. Cloud support is also hiding off the bottom, or if you want to add any notes, feel free to do so. In the meantime, Jana's question: any war stories about saying no? If anyone wants to do a brief, harrowing experience from which you learned something, or maybe not so harrowing. Raise your hand.
I could share. It's not really a war story, but just it's sort of failure to say no in some sense. I'm at UCLA and I work in an academic unit, so I'm not campus wide. So someone came to us asking for support, and we basically said some version of no. And they went to another unit on campus and got some support and built this thing, and then we ended up having to host and maintain it anyway. So yeah, so the lesson learned there is just to, I feel like partnering across campus as best we can to, and having regular communications with those other partners who are doing support, so that everybody can be on the same page about these things, which is hard to do, but.
Yeah. Thanks, Annalene. Jacqueline.
Okay. Yeah, the war story I have is a graduate student that we were helping, and we gave a lot of support for helping him move on to our HPC cluster and parallelizing his code. And it got to the point where he couldn't do anything without us. And after he graduated and took a job in another country, he still contacted us anytime he had questions. So I think we should have set clearer boundaries at the beginning, not necessarily say no altogether, but really establish some good boundaries there.
Yeah. Thanks, Jacqueline. I think that's I'm sure other people on the call have had that. I've certainly had that experience with people where it seemed more expedient to just help them. But then in the long run, they didn't develop the like capabilities that they really should have been developing in order to use the systems. Yeah, Daniel.
Oh, go ahead.
I can probably share something else from my own experience, and it's about when you say no and they go around you to your manager or the manager of your manager directly to complain, and then things become complicated. And I've been in that situation a couple of times, and
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it. You know, you have to be ready. You have to be smart, just in case, you know, that happens.
Yeah, I think that kind of touches on what Annalise shared about sort of they said no, someone else said yes, they came back to them. And someone earlier shared in the chat this sort of, it's an institutional issue, which is hard because it's not something we can solve in our units of some groups say yes, and then someone else has to bear the burden of that commitment. I don't have any answers for that. If any of you do, please chime in. Andy, go ahead and share.
Yeah, it's nothing specific. I was just going to say that I think to a great degree, and it's sort of baked into academia, is that people don't take no for an answer. They will find a way to do something. And oftentimes, you know, it's quite suboptimal. But it seems to me to relate to the other topic that was on the graph earlier about sensitive data projects. If we don't provide ways in which to do that, and a lot of people answered that institutionally there isn't, you know, support for that, that doesn't mean those projects aren't happening. It means those projects are happening in ways that are very risky for the institution. I don't have an answer to that. But the bottom line is people will find a way and people will do things regardless of the answer.
Very true. Thank you, Andy. Shafaq?
Hi, I was going to attempt to respond to Daniel, I guess. So when someone is going to go behind and talk to the manager, the way you approach that, and because the manager, of course, is going to tell you to do something or whatever, you know, so you just tell them, okay, if I do that, then I can't do this other thing. So you put the prioritization piece and the ball back on the manager's court, and you also, you know, are able to show that the time is, you know, limited, and the reason for saying no was because the focus was on this thing. So if that focus needs to be readjusted, let's do that, right? So that would be one way to handle that situation.
Yeah, thanks. And that ties back to, I think, one of the strategies that Carrie mentioned at the beginning, which is essentially the, you know, conditions. You know, if you want me to do this, then something else has to change, or I can't work on this project or something like that. So, yeah.
To add to that, Christina, really quick, I think that also that's going to be key, you know, and here we're jumping into something more, but you will have to also create, right? Boundaries are created everywhere, right? So you also have to create boundaries around your manager, right? Because if you have consulted, you did your part, and your answer is no to a particular project because it cannot be done, or the time or the resources, right? Having that clear communication and those clear boundaries and expectations with your manager become also key, right? And you would expect that if you are in, you know, regardless of the institution, your team, right, it has to be a level of trust and value or weight on, you know, why you be so willing to say no to something, right? So I think that also has to do with that culture of that particular group too, and that level of trust with your either your team members or with your manager.
That's a great point, Gladys. It's not just establishing trust with the people we're working with, the researchers, but within our team, that we hopefully in the ideal situation have each other's backs and can support each other in the work that we're doing and not doing.
Excellent.
Yeah, Alex, go ahead and chime in.
Hey, yeah, as a researcher, this is a very negative conversation we're having with, of course, that's what it is, right? But we're advocates too, right? Like, make sure you tell us, not everybody, you don't want it to sound like you're complaining, but tell us also why. I just found out we're down to 1.5 FTEs in our research facilitation crew, and I didn't know that. So I told the CIO, I'm like, this can't happen. Like, there's ways to percolate positivity up or solutions up. So please remember that when you have people out there that are got your back, that I could write in grants too for stuff, and just we can help.
Yeah.
Help the problem.
Yeah, that's a nice circle back, Alex, to kind of how we started, that the assumption here is that we want to help researchers. The reason we're saying no is for whatever reason we have these limitations, but we want to make things happen. And so leveraging the trust we have with people we've worked with, or explaining why, or whatever, are ways to make sure that the research project moves forward, within the context that we have around us. Yeah, Carrie, did you want to chime in, or did I steal what you were going to say?
You basically said what I was going to say, which is I try to always explain why when I have to say no. I find that researchers are a little bit more understanding if you can explain that this is, why this is a security risk, or why we don't do it this way. Or one of my favorites is a lot of other units do it this same way because of this reason. And so when you appeal to that level of authority, they'll give, if they can understand your reasons, that helps keep them, oh gosh, I'm so sorry, but it builds that trust that you're helping define their goals, but it also kind of helps prevent them from finding insecure or less appealing options too.
Yeah. All right, we should wrap up because we're coming up to the top of the hour. So first, we had a bunch of topics that we didn't discuss. We kind of focused on 2 of them. If there's any of these you'd like to have more of an open conversation about, like how do you support software or not? How do you support virtual machines or not? And what does that mean for you and your relationship with researchers? Please let us know. That would be super helpful input. Thank you to everyone who shared today. I hope this was a useful discussion. With that, Jana, I'll turn it over to you to close it off.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up on one thing that Alex said, just reminding me that, we work to our capacity and then our capacity is filled up. And the way we can grow that capacity out is if researchers communicate to the people who distribute funds, so that straightforward communication is really vital. So thank you for raising that, Alex. All right, well, it was really nice to see everybody. Happy New Year. We made it to 2022. Hope everybody stays safe. If you haven't signed in, there's still a link, and we'll add you to our mailing list if you got here without being on the mailing list. This call was recorded. We will be sending out a copy of that link after we've had a chance to process it. Today's topic was on saying no. I just really want to thank Christina and Carrie and Martin for really taking the lead on organizing this conversation. One thing I didn't really appreciate till today was how many times people have said no to me in ways that I didn't realize that they were saying no until I saw the slide and I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, so that was very helpful. Our next call is scheduled for February 10th. The topic is yet to be determined. So I threw a link in on our call topics survey. So if you'd like to have an impact on where these conversations go, we certainly want to hear from you. We are continually looking for other people to help us out on the research facing call steering committee. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to Justin Booth. I dropped his email in the chat earlier. It is a fun group, and you can influence the kinds of topics that we bring to the community that way. So thanks to everybody who worked on the call. So that would be Justin, Gladys, Christina, Martin, Annalie, Katya, and I'm Jana Nugent, and Carrie. Yes. So thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.